So thanks everyone for coming to our DFEND 2.0 series. Welcome to all of you who are new, and thank you and welcome to our regular attendees. So my name is Jamie Baum, and I lead the DFEND project along with Dr. Erin Howey and Angela Tassinelli. So today we're going to talk about carbohydrates and fat, and this is more probably like a background knowledge on what are carbs and fats, because I think they both have bad reputations sort of in social media and things you see. And so just to give a little more about some understanding. And then if Angela will be monitoring the chat, and she'll put links up there. And so everyone, just make sure to mute yourselves, and we'll go ahead and get started. Maybe I can mute other.
Yeah.
Let's see. I'm trying to figure out if I can mute people automatically. I can't figure out how to do that. Okay, I'll just go ahead and share my screen.
I do have it, but you know what? My employment is running out, so my
Hey, Chris, can you mute your computer?
Yeah, I'm fine.
It's okay, thanks. Okay. Can everyone see those slides okay?
Yes, we can.
Okay. So today we're just going to talk about the different types of carbohydrates and fat. I'm going to stop my video. Can you still see it if I mute my video? Yeah.
Yes.
Okay. About the dietary recommendations for carbohydrates and fats, the role they play in the body, because they are essential for bodies to function. Some of the risks they play in cardiovascular disease, and understanding some of the health benefits that carbs and fats offer. And most of the information and images in this presentation come from this textbook, Nutrition for a Changing World. Oops. Oh. Okay, so we'll start with carbohydrates. So carbohydrates are made from carbons, hydrogens, and oxygens. So they're often abbreviated in the scientific literature as C, H, and O. And so, because they're made from carbons, hydrogens, and oxygens. They can be composed of one or more sugar units, and we'll talk about that in a different slide. And they contain 4 calories per gram. So a lot of times when you hear people talk about high protein diets and reducing carbs and increasing protein, one reason they're an even swap is because they're both 4 calories per gram. So in food, they are sources of fiber, and they provide sweetness and flavor. And in our body, it's really the source of energy for all cells in our body. So our brain and our blood cells can't live without carbohydrates. Oops. Oh. And they're important for our muscle during exercise, and also they're stored in our liver to be used like in times of fasting and overnight. It's important for our gut health, and it reduces the use of protein and energy. So we don't want to use our body proteins for energy. So fruits, veggies, grains, milk, and milk products are really good sources of carbohydrates. They play a vital function in our body. So like I said, it's a source of energy for all our cells. It provides 4 calories per gram, and the dietary recommendation is to consume around 45 to 65% of total calories from carbohydrates. It's an indispensable source of energy for brain, red blood cells, and exercise. It reduces the use of our body proteins for energy, and it's a good source of fiber and adds sweetness and flavors to food. So carbohydrates can be simple or complex. So I think when people sort of feel fear about carbohydrates, it may be from some of these more simple carbohydrates, which are 1 or 2 sugars, versus these complex carbohydrates, which tend to be our whole grains. They come from beans and legumes and some vegetables, and these are more like our fibers, and they're longer strains or complexes of carbohydrates. And this just gives an example here of the carbohydrate content in grams for different sources of food. So you can see, the more whole grain foods have lower grams of carbohydrate, but not necessarily the percentages of carbohydrates. So simple carbohydrates can be monosaccharides or disaccharides. So a monosaccharide has one sugar unit, and these would be things like glucose, fructose, and galactose. So galactose is one of the monosaccharides that make up lactose, which is milk sugar. And then sucrose is one glucose and one fructose, and this is what is normal table sugar. It's also found in fruits and vegetables, but this is what you would buy to use for baking. And then maltose is mostly starch, and it's not found very often in the food we eat. But when we think about carbohydrates, and I think this is where people become afraid of carbohydrates, it's really about the added sugar. So in the American diet, added sugars are about 13% of our daily calorie intake, and the dietary guidelines recommend that we consume less than 10% of our calories that we eat from added sugars. And most of these added sugars are coming from things like soda. So beverages that are not milk or 100% fruit juice. So you can see here it's about 25% from soft drinks, fruit-based drinks, sports and energy drinks is actually a really small portion. Alcohol makes up a big portion, or no, alcohol is only 1%, and then coffee and tea. So these would be like when we add sugar to sweeten our coffee and our tea. Snacks is a really big portion of added sugar. And then you can see the other contributors to the diet, but a lot of it comes from sugar sweetened beverages and snacks. So there's a really nice fact sheet about sugar alternatives and non-nutritive sweeteners on the Extension website. But this just summarizes, because I think also some people have fear of using alternative sweeteners, and food manufacturers do this as a way to replace sugar. So to keep the taste, but removing the calories. So these next two slides just summarize the different sweeteners that are out there and how they're used in foods. So I'd actually never heard of tagatose or naturalose, but I guess it's used like sucrose, like table sugar, to provide bulk and sweetness into ice cream, cakes, and candies. Sugar alcohols are really, really popular, especially in like some of these like meal replacement beverages or meal replacement bars. It's what's used in sugarless gum, sugar-free candy. And the reason it's calorie-free or that you don't digest it is because it's not metabolized by the bacteria in our mouth. So a lot of carbohydrates are broken down in our mouth. There's an enzyme there called amylase. And it doesn't prevent tooth decay, or it does not promote tooth decay. So actually, you know, my dad's a dentist, and he always used to tell us if we can't brush our teeth after a meal, choose some sugar-free gum, because it will help wash the bacteria and like in foods off your teeth. And then mannitol and xylitol. So xylitol is what's used a lot also in sugarless gum and mouthwash. And then there are non-nutritive sweeteners. So these might be ones a lot of people recognize, like NutraSweet, so aspartame, which is used in a lot of like diet sodas. Sweet and Low is saccharin. Stevia, which comes from a plant that's like isolated from a South American plant, and sucralose, which you would find with Splenda. And basically what sucralose or Splenda is just that it's a different isomer or form of glucose that can't be recognized or digested by the body. And so far, all of these sweeteners are on the GRAS list, so that's the FDA or Food and Drug Administration's list that's generally recognized as safe, or GRAS, so they're safe for human consumption. So then we have complex carbohydrates. We have the simple carbohydrates, which are like the simple sugars, and then complex carbohydrates, which are starches and fibers. And you can see that these have a lot of these little sugar molecules here that are linked either in branches or long chains, and they are more bulky. And they're a lot of times what are found in like high fiber foods, like in the leaves of plants, nuts, whole grains, vegetables, berries, and things like that. So Americans, we don't do a very good job of meeting our recommended fiber intake. And meeting the dietary guidelines for fiber is linked to decreased risk of colon cancer. So males age 19 to 50 need around 38 grams of fiber per day, and females need around 25 grams of fiber today, and the average American intake is 17 grams of fiber per day. So I think this isn't surprising because we also know most Americans don't meet their dietary guidelines for fruit and vegetable intake. That's an area where we're weak, and it's reflected in our fiber intake. And this just shows fiber content of selected foods so that you'll be able to see it if you want to go back to the slides, after this talk. So you can see a lot of cereals are good sources of fiber. A lot of cereals or things that have whole grains may have fiber. And fiber has health benefits because it can keep us fuller longer after a meal, and it may reduce the risk of obesity. Some fibers have some cereals have a certain type of fiber that can't be broken down by the body. And it's been shown that some of these fibers can reduce the risk of heart disease or type 2 diabetes. And it has a lot of other health benefits. So it may reduce, like I said, cardiovascular disease risk, increases fullness after a meal, may reduce the risk of type 2 diabetes. It slows our increase in blood glucose or blood sugar following a carbohydrate-based meal. And it can also have high insoluble fiber intake and soften our stool and reduce the occurrence of constipation. And you'll see a lot of whole grain like Cheerios and oatmeal. So I think we're going to add in a lecture later in this DFEND series to talk about these health claims that are made on the front of cereals or different types of food and how they're regulated. But things that are high in fiber and especially whole grains are allowed to put these claims on the front of their packages about the potential to lower cholesterol as part of a heart healthy diet. So there's a lot of science showing the benefit of whole grains and fiber on our health. So what makes something a whole grain? This is what a whole grain looks like. So this is a grain, a kernel of wheat. Oops, sorry, I need to lay off the mouse there. In the endosperm, that's the inner part, it contains the highest amounts of starch and protein, and this is all that remains when a grain becomes refined. A bran contains the majority of the dietary fiber and a lot of the B vitamins and minerals, so that surrounds this inner endosperm. And the germ is the embryo of the seed that germinates and grows that contains a lot of the essential fatty acids and more B vitamins and minerals. So if you're eating a whole grain, you're getting the entire part of the grain. But when it becomes processed, you're just left with this endosperm. So like if you eat brown rice versus white rice, that's a good example. So the white rice has been refined and it's removed this outer layer of bran that contains a lot of the fiber. So that's what I just said, refined grains. So these are like white grains, white flours. They strip off the germ and bran, leaving only the inner endosperm. And a lot of these are why we enrich our grain products, especially our refined grains. So it should replace some of the nutrients that are lost in the processing to prevent deficiencies. And it's also, if you want to eat a whole grain or high fiber food, it's important to look at the ingredient list when you're looking at a package, because whole grain should be the very first ingredient for like your whole grain breads or pastas or other high fiber grain products. If it's not the first ingredient, then it's probably not a good source of whole grain. So this whole grain stamp is used in 36 different countries, and it tells consumers whether the product contains at least 8 grams of whole grains per serving. So you can see here it will 50% whole grain or 100% whole grain. You sometimes see this on the front of packages. And the dietary guidelines for Americans, so we have the fiber range, but you really should consume at least half of the grains or carbohydrates you eat as whole grains. Look for whole grains as the first ingredient. And the American Heart Association said to look for products with a total carbohydrate to fiber ratio that is less than 10:1. So you would do that. Let's see if I have an example here. I don't think I put the example, but if you look at your nutrition label, you should see something that says carbohydrates and have a total number. And then under that, it's usually broken down into added sugars and fiber. And if you do the math, the ratio should be 10:1, carbohydrates to fiber. So these are just showing the recommendations for carbohydrate intake, kind of summarized from different organizations. So the dietary guidelines for Americans, and we should be receiving a new set of dietary guidelines sometime this year because they're updated every 5 years. The Health and Medicine Division recommendations, so the daily reference intakes. And then American Heart Association has some guidelines, and the World Health Organization also has guidelines. So the dietary guidelines are just consuming half your grains as whole grains and consuming less than 10% of your calories from added sugar. And then carbs should be around 45 to 65% of your total calorie. But again, the fiber needs are below, so they decrease a little bit over the age of 50. And so now moving on to fats. And if you guys have questions, type them in the chat because I know I'm talking fast, and Angela will make sure we come back to them. So there's lots of different fats and lipids in the body. They include fatty acids, triglycerides. So these are two things that you may get back from, the doctor, sterols and phospholipids. They're diverse in their structure and function. They also contain carbon, hydrogen, and oxygens, just like carbohydrates, and they generally are insoluble in water. And I think we see a lot of this, like when you try to make your own salad dressing, you see that it's hard to disperse or keep the oil and the waters together. So fatty acids, these become a major energy source for fuel. Triglycerides are the most abundant fat in our diet, and they're how fat is stored in our diet in the form of triglycerides. And that just means it has these 3 fatty acids held together by a backbone. Sterol, so cholesterol is the primary dietary sterol and probably the one most of us are familiar with. And phospholipids, these make up all of our cell membranes, so they're really important and play an important role in our body. So so we need fat in our body. I think, for a while, for those of us that remember, like the Snackwell's diet and everything was about low fat, but actually in 2015 is the first time they've removed a limit on fat intake because they found that Americans weren't eating enough healthy fats. And we need them because they make up the cell membranes of all our cells. They're what make our cell membranes flexible. We need them for the synthesis of hormones in our body. So a lot of cholesterol is a backbone for a lot of hormones that we make. It's a concentrated source of energy, and we need fat to carry fat-soluble nutrients. So there's vitamins like vitamin A, D, E, and K that need a fat source to be able to be used and taken up by the body. And then there are some essential fatty acids like linoleic and alpha-linolenic acid that our body can't make and we need to get from the diet. So like fat helps transport your nutrients around, helps with absorption of your fat-soluble vitamins. It's the primary storage form of energy in our body, and it also serves to cushion, protect, and insulate our body's organs to prevent it from damage, if we're jostled or things like that. So fat also serves important functions in the food we eat. So it does contribute to our feelings of fullness after we eat. Fats stay in the stomach longer than carbohydrates, and they're absorbed over a longer period of time. I think most of us can agree that fats increase the palatability, so the flavor and the taste of the foods we eat, and they contribute to the texture and the aroma of foods. So fats in foods are found in a mixture of different fatty acids, and that determines whether they're a solid fat or a liquid fat at room temperature. So there's this thing called saturation. So that means if all of these carbons that are part of a fat molecule have hydrogens attached, it's saturated. And you'll see saturated fat broken down on your food label. So these are the less healthy fats. These are the ones that can contribute to artery blockage and tend to create plaques. And they tend to be solid at room temperature. So this would be like the fat you find in steak, coconut butter, or coconut oil, butter, cream cheese, cheeses. They tend to be more saturated fat. Monounsaturated fat just means that there's one of these double bonds, so it's missing some of the hydrogens. They are liquid at room temperature, and same with polyunsaturated fatty acids. And these are the 2 fatty acids that are attributed to the health benefits that you find in like nuts, olive oils, avocados, and things like that. And then you have these cis and trans fatty acids, and that just means it's the way that the acid is bent in the food. I think, trans fats there are naturally occurring trans fats, but other trans fats have been banned from the foods we eat because they do increase the risk for cardiovascular disease. But naturally, you can find some trans fats in dairy and animal products. But those don't seem to have the same negative health effect as the trans fats that were occurring during manufacturing. And you found those a lot in like room temperature or fatty baked goods. So all dietary fats contain saturated, monounsaturated, and polyunsaturated fatty acids. They just vary in the different amounts. So you want to choose fats, especially cooking oils, that are low in saturated fat and have a mixture of the other healthy fats. So you can see here, nuts and some of these cooking oils have low saturated fat, but high mono and polyunsaturated fatty acids. Again, these nuts are higher in the monounsaturated fats, and then animal fats and tropical oils are typically really high in saturated fat. So coconut oil actually is one of the only fats recommended by like 9 different nutrition and health organizations to consume in limited amounts because it is the most saturated fat out there. And it's popular in the food industry, or used to be really popular, just like palm oil, these tropical oils, because they have a really high melting temperature, which means you can process foods at a really high temperature and they won't be impacted by the oil going bad. So butter is highly saturated, and then the meats like chicken or eggs or ground beef tend to be a little bit lower in saturated fats. So cholesterol is only found in animal foods. It's not an essential nutrient, so we don't really need to eat it because our liver can make enough to meet the needs of our body, so to produce like the hormones and things we need. It's required for synthesis of bile acids, vitamin D, and steroid hormones, and it doesn't provide energy for our body. And then the things like the essential fatty acids are the ones our body can't make and that we need to get through the diet. Our body can't make these fatty acids. One example is linoleic acid, which is an omega-6 fatty acid, and then linolenic acid, which is an omega-3 fatty acid. So I'm sure a lot of you have heard of omega-3s or are taking them as supplements. And they found that high intake of omega-3 fatty acids, so in cultures where they eat a lot of fatty fish, tend to have a really low rate of heart disease. Also, people who follow the Mediterranean diet, it's thought because the diet's high in omega-3 fatty acids and poly and monounsaturated fatty acids from olive oil that contribute to low heart disease rates. So the dietary recommendation for fat intake is 20 to 35% of total calories, but actually they've kind of taken away this upper limit in the dietary guidelines. But this is just a recommended range. And just like added sugars, you want to eat as little saturated fat, so also less than 10% of your total calories as possible. And you want to use caution when substituting fat with simple or refined carbohydrates. So this is what happened with SnackWells. They took out the fat and just added simple sugars because they can still make you gain weight. And they're also thought, simple sugars, to contribute to heart disease. And so here are just some examples of common foods that are high in saturated fats. So mixed dishes like burgers, pizza, pasta dishes, different like hot dogs, snacks and sweets, always a culprit, dairy products, some protein foods, like some of the more fatty pieces of meat, a lot of condiments, and some vegetables, grains, and beverages. So how do we determine the amount and types of fat in the food we eat? Well, like I mentioned before with fibers, you just have to look at the total fat content on the diet or on the nutritional facts panel, and you'll see saturated fat should be listed, and it will tell you what % of the calories is coming from saturated fat. So this would be right at the borderline, 10%. And then going back to that carbohydrate example, you should see total carbs, total fiber, and total sugars to be able to calculate that ratio. And then you should always check your ingredients to see what are these sources of fat. So you can see cocoa butter, palm kernel oil, fully hydrogenated palm oil. So these are some of those saturated tropical oils that we talked about. And I'm almost finished here. So dietary lipids may play a role in decreasing, so dietary fats are risk of developing dementia. So you see that a lot in these Mediterranean type diets. And we talked a little about it in DFEND 1.0, but there's something called the MIND diet that's high in omega-3 fatty acids and healthy fats and nuts that may help reduce risk for Alzheimer's disease. And actually, there's this study, I think it's pronounced Bogalusa heart study, and it was actually the first study to demonstrate that what we eat in childhood can start heart disease. So heart disease starts when we're young. They followed 16,000 people from childhood and found 40% living below poverty level. And they found that basically their physical activity and lifestyle contribute from a young age to developing heart disease when they were older. And cardiovascular disease is the leading cause of death in the US. So 34% of US adults have high blood pressure, 31% of all deaths are caused by cardiovascular disease. Currently, 37% of American adults have cardiovascular disease, and 12% have high cholesterol. And then there are risk factors that can't be changed for the risk. So your family history, race. So African Americans are at higher risk for developing cardiovascular disease, and age. So as we age, our risk increases. And this is due to, but actually diet and lifestyle choices can reduce our risk for cardiovascular disease by about 80%. So paying attention to our diet, physical activity, our body weight, our alcohol consumption, and whether or not we smoke. I'll just put this here for your information. This just gives the ranges of total cholesterol, HDL cholesterol, and LDL cholesterol that are healthy versus unhealthy. And we know that dietary fats and heart disease have a complex relationship. So saturated fats and trans fats raise our cholesterol and our bad cholesterol, LDL cholesterol. We know these polyunsaturated fats reduce our risk. Monounsaturated fats could increase our good cholesterol and lower our overall cholesterol. And we know that omega-6 and omega-3 fatty acid ratio also plays an important role in the risk. And this just shows where different foods in our diet are contributing to saturated fat intake. So cheese is a big one, as well as milk and pizza and grain-based desserts. So pizza and grain-based desserts are culprits for a lot of things, and then other foods. So just to summarize, so we have time for questions. We talked about the different types of carbohydrates and fats in the diet, their functions in the body and in the food we eat, and the dietary recommendations. So it's a lot of information, but I'm happy now to stop sharing and answer any questions you guys may have.
So Casey asked, what is the minimum fat needed?
I'm not sure actually, Casey, what the minimum fat is needed, because I know our body can make fat except these essential fatty acids. Did you read anything, Angela?
No, and I tried to, you know, when I was creating the fast facts that you can find on the website relating to this week's talk, I did try to include the dietary guidelines. The dietary guidelines recommend, you know, just making sure to have healthy fats as opposed to those unhealthy fats. And some of the fast facts break down like what are the healthier fats for you versus unhealthier fats when you are including them in the diet.
And I mean, I think there's no official recommendation for omega-3 fatty acids, but it seems like based on the science, you need around 3 to 4 grams a day. But because our body can make cholesterol and some of the fats, and we can turn carbohydrates into triglycerides for storage, I don't know if there's necessarily a lower limit. And I think like the scary part is that, or what the concern is that has happened over the last few years is they're finding these added sugars and simple carbohydrates are actually also increasing risk for heart disease more than some of the dietary fats. So what are some examples of grain-based desserts? So something like cobbler, pastry, anything like a donut, a brownie, a cookie, a cake, those would be examples, I think, of grain-based desserts. Trying to think, yeah, anything that's mostly carbs. And then, yeah, Angela shared something with you, Casey, about ADHD, because I don't know much about omega-3s.
I just did a quick look for you, Casey, so you may have to look a little deeper, but it appears that the National Institute of Health, or the NIH, is currently concluding that, there isn't enough research on an association for any benefits with regards to omega-3s and ADD or ADHD at this point in time.
And what are concerns surrounding use of artificial sweeteners? So, I think it's important to remember that they are generally recognized as safe. Some people say, like, for weight loss, still giving that sense of sweetness could be a bad thing with cravings. I think a lot of the controversy stems from a few animal studies that were conducted a long time ago that show maybe artificial sweeteners can, like, give you cancer or make you die or things like that. But I think it's important that people know those were in rodent studies. And, like, you would have to consume the equivalent of like 20 to 30 liters of Diet Coke a day to get the amount of sweetener that they used in those rodent studies. So they're really not translatable, I think, to human research. And the same thing happens with high fructose corn syrup, even though it is an added sugar and you should limit intake. The data that's shown some of these, like, scary things about high fructose corn syrup were also given to rodents in a much higher dose than we would probably consume normally. Cholesterol, a lot of protein through animal food. So I know there's a number, and I feel like dietary cholesterol really can only impact your total cholesterol by like 10%. And so, like, when you change your diet, if you have high cholesterol, you can maybe make your cholesterol levels fluctuate by like 10%. It's really weight loss that can change your cholesterol and physical activity. So I think you should really limit some of the high fat proteins, like, that are high in saturated fats. And you would notice that by, like, the marbling. But I think you have to balance, like, the protein intake. And then, if you are eating a steak, just cut back on some of the other saturated fat you may take in during the day. Can you explain? So always talk to your doctor, especially if you have high cholesterol, you're on medicine. But it is okay to eat chicken, shrimp, and eggs. So eggs for a long time had a bad rap about having high cholesterol. For about 15 to 20 years, it's been shown that they actually don't impact your cholesterol. And we actually, getting ready to, it's under review now, published a study where people ate 10 eggs a week for 12 or 16 weeks, and there was no change in cholesterol levels. And your was really low when you lived in Alaska and ate a lot of fresh salmon. Yeah, so that kind of goes to that data where they found, like, a lot of Eskimos living in Greenland had high fatty fish intake and had lower levels of cholesterol. It just seems to be the healthy fats versus the saturated fats. And I know shrimp has high cholesterol, but I haven't seen any data that it actually links to, like, human cholesterol levels. And chicken is pretty lean, so you won't find a lot of saturated fat in chicken. And, like, remember what all of our cells have cholesterol in them. It's important for cell structure and function. And same with animals. So could you have 2 egg omelets several times a week safely? So I think it depends what you put in your omelet. Like, if it's egg whites or eggs with no cheese, I would think it's okay. But I think it's the cheese that has a lot of saturated fat and calories that could make your omelet turn from, healthy to less healthy. But yeah, eat more chicken and eat more fiber. We really are bad at eating fiber, but we're also bad at eating fruits and vegetables in this country. So, they've shown that meeting the fiber recommendations reduces risk for colon cancer by a lot. So I think that's an area where, we could most of us could improve. And I think that's one of the risks when people eliminate carbohydrates or different fruits and vegetables from their diet. We risk lowering our fiber intake. So we're a little bit over. Does anyone else have any questions? You can always email us. Angela made some nice fast facts this week. And if you want to know anything else, any more information, we can make other fast facts.
Yes. Okay. I would like to ask a question, please. I would like to ask about the sweetener stevia. What's about the stevia as sweeteners? And that's obese people try to get a diet to lose their weight. and they substitute the sugars with stevia. It is okay or have any side effects?
So I'm not an expert in artificial sweeteners, so I can't. So I'd always say if you're concerned, ask a dietitian or the doctor, but I think that's one of the benefits of stevia is that it does cut out calories and provides people with sweetness. So because it is generally recognized as safe by the FDA, I think as long as it's not a ton of stevia and like used in the right portion size, it should be okay, I would think. Because if you even notice that with sugar sweetened beverages make up such a large part of added sugars, just by switching Diet Coke, you could switch, you know, a lot of the added sugar, or diet soda, a lot of the added sugars in your diet. But so far, I mean, I know a lot of people that use stevia, and I think a stevia, no, that's Splenda that can be used in baking and things. So I think if it helps, I think it's a thing. Quantity and things, it's like talking to an expert is probably in artificial sweeteners. But I haven't seen any data, Angela. I don't know if you've come across it on.
I haven't, and you know, that's again not really a topic unless I'm asked about it that I look into very often. But it is something we can explore.
Well, and I think in the tables that are in the slides, I didn't go through them in detail. But it does talk about like the uses in the highlights. And so it does talk about whether they're used frequently or not. And so for stevia, it does say it's approved. It's been approved since 2008, and it's used primarily in drinks or like in packets and sometimes in yogurt. But so I feel like if there were really serious side effects, it's been 12 years, we would have heard a lot more about that. But again, it's only been on the market for 12 years, so we don't know how over the long period it might impact your health. We don't have Instagram, Chris. We have a website. Angela just shared it with all of our information, and there's a link to our YouTube channel as well.
Yeah, so here is the website link again for anyone who missed it at the beginning. And I also shared for Chris, but anybody, and it's also available on our website, for a fast fact that was developed in our 1.0 session. And in that fast fact, it just kind of talks about, you know, how to navigate and recognize reliable nutrition information when you're going to do your own research on the internet. And it gives some good, you know, navigation points and how to, you know, kind of check the site or article that you're reading to make sure it is validated with good resources and licensed professionals. And then at the bottom, there's also links to credible research-based websites to help you find some information as well.
So I guess we'll sign off because we're about 8 minutes over, and we want to try to keep these within the lunch period. Thanks for everyone for calling in, and we hope to see you again next week. I think I forgot to put the topic next week. I think it's about microbiome.
It is the microbiome, prebiotics, and probiotics.
Yes, we'll be talking a lot about gut health. Okay.
Okay.
Thank you, everyone. Have a nice Friday.
Thank you.
Bye.